Welcome to Bloom, a conversations podcast about anything and everything. I'm lucky to be joined today by Benson Saulo, a trailblazing 32-year-old who's already had an extraordinary, interesting and diverse career across the social impact space, consulting, banking and finance, diplomacy and advocacy. Benson was recently appointed as the first Indigenous Consul-General to the United States, so we're very fortunate to be speaking with him before he heads off to the US later in the year with his family. Thank you so much for joining me today, Benson. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm really pleased to be here.
To kick things off, I was hoping you could tell us how you found stage 4 lockdown here in Melbourne.
Well, stage 4 is definitely a lot harder, particularly going into lockdown for a second time. But, I've been quite fortunate. So we have an 8-month-old daughter, and, being able to work from home, I've been able to, see her grow and develop. And, it's a very unique opportunity as a father to be able to spend so much time with a young'un. So I've actually, as much as it has been quite difficult, and particularly stage 4 and only being able to get outside, for an hour a day for exercise, and then also working from home, within that there's also the blessing of being able to spend time with my wife and an 8-month-old daughter. Her name's Anais, and she's recently started crawling, and she's teething like nobody's business, and it's all going on.
Oh, fantastic. And you're a keen cyclist. I don't imagine there would be too much cycling going on now, especially in winter, but also with the 5-kilometre radius that we've all got.
That's true. Although we're in a quite fortunate space. So we're in St Kilda, and within the 5-kilometre radius, we actually have Albert Park Lake. So,
perfect.
Being able to do a couple of loops of Albert Park Lake, and also I've been taking out the runners and getting out and on the sidewalks.
Fantastic. So for our listeners not as familiar with you or your story, could you please provide a bit of a snapshot of your early life and story to date, from growing up in rural New South Wales in Tamworth to moving to the big southern metropolis of Melbourne?
Sure. So, I grew up in Tamworth, country music capital of Australia. Although I reckon it still rivals Nashville, Tennessee, and I will be checking it out to see how it compares. I'll be taking notes. So growing up in Tamworth was fantastic. That's where I did all my growing and all my schooling before moving away. I was quite fortunate to, in my upbringing, my mum and dad ran the community and Aboriginal church in town. So my father's a minister, and so faith always played a very strong role in our upbringing, and then also mix that with culture. So my mum is Aboriginal, so we're connected to the Wemba Wemba, Jadawajali, Wirragai and Gunditjmara nations of Western Victoria. And then on my father's side, he's from New Ireland province in Papua New Guinea. Our family is very much still living in the traditional village up there, so culture plays a really strong role. So we have this really beautiful mix in our household of not only faith but then also the mix of culture as a really strong foundation. So the strong values around respect and inclusion, as well as kind of that sense of responsibility, was always ingrained from a very young age.
That's incredible.
We were also quite fortunate as well in Tamworth, which is Gomeroi country, having such strong elders as we're growing up. These were elders that were the cornerstones of our communities. They were the ones that, started the first legal services as well as the first medical services, and, even, played a role in setting up early childcare programs and businesses like Birrali, which is the childcare centre in Tamworth. And they used to tell us this story, and it was this idea of it was linked to what's called the Warrnambool, which is the Gomeroi word for the Milky Way, or actually it kind of translates more to this idea of the great river in the sky. Yeah. And so as we're growing up, we're told this story that when we pass away, our spirit returns to the Warrnambool, and we called home by the fires that our ancestors lit by the great river in the sky, and it was the smoke that would call us home. And then we sit up there on the banks of the Warrnambool and would reflect on the life that we've had, those late night philosophical conversations, those really deep connections that we've had with friends and family and loved ones. And then when it's our time to return back to this cycle of life, we come in the form of shooting stars and lay within Mother Earth. And then when we're born, it's not so much this idea of conception. It's more around this idea that your spirit chooses who you're meant to be in the time that you're meant to exist. And as a young person, hearing this story being told and almost weaved into our in our education as we're growing up, it really established this sense of purpose, and this almost this sense of an urgency of now. That belief that the people that we connect with in our life are the people that are sharing that same cycle, and it's actually up to us to think about who's coming after us, and how do we prepare the world for them to for their moment.
Yeah.
And so this kind of this upbringing of faith and upbringing of culture, for me, really provided such a strong foundation to then think about myself differently in regards to, well, what role do I play here? With the time that I have, what kind of impact ultimately do I want to have? And my life actually, as I was growing up, I wanted to be a pro skateboarder or play rugby for the Wallabies. I stopped growing at about grade 9, so the Wallabies were never going to take me.
Yeah.
And actually, when I was 15, I actually started as a school-based trainee at ANZ Bank, and so I was the third trainee to come through this particular program, and it meant that during year 11 and 12, while I was completing my HSC, I was also working 1 day a week at the bank as a bank teller, getting that hands-on experience. But by the time I finished high school, I also finished with a certificate in business services and business finance as well, and which really kind of opened me up to what kind of possibilities. So finance participating in the financial sector for our people has often kind of been excluded. If you're coming from a place of poverty, then money, isn't something that you really think about, or what happens with your money. And so, when we moving into the bank and understanding finance and understanding transactions and and the role of finance in your life, that really kind of opened up possibilities as to, well, where would I like to go in the future. And it was actually from that point where I, as you know, kind of took that path into the finance sector for about 7 years with ANZ Bank.
Yeah, amazing. So, and was that a move to Melbourne when you shifted down south? And I suppose in making that move, how did you keep connected to country as well, and that sort of rich cultural heritage and life that you spoke about quite poetically?
Yeah, so I actually moved to Sydney. So I have an older brother and older sister, and my older brother and my sister were both living in Sydney at the time. So there was already that natural kind of pull to make a move to Sydney. So I left home when I was about 17 years old. I was kind of youngish for my age, going into into high school or into primary school, and so that was always that's where I kind of wanted to be. It was where I kind of saw the opportunity to study. So I decided to start off my studies doing a Bachelor of Business Management and Marketing, whilst also still working in the bank. And it was about 6 months into my studies that I decided, I didn't really, it didn't really connect with me. I felt that it didn't really translate into the real world, for lack of a better term. And there was also, coming from the country, going to the school that I did, which was across the train tracks. It was the school where majority of my high school friends either stayed in Tamworth or moved up the road to Armidale Uni. So it was a really close, tight knit kind of community. So coming away from from Tamworth into Sydney, I remember, and I still kind of describe that first 6 months living in Sydney as the loneliest time that I've ever had in my life. Not being able to connect into new friends circles, kind of being a bit lost in the big smoke.
Isolating,
and, yeah, it was very isolating at the time, and so I actually kind of dropped out. I dropped out of uni at that point, and we've always been set up, if you're not studying, you got to be doing something. And so working is what I really dove into. And so, I spent 4 years living in Sydney. When I was 19, I was promoted up to a business banking assistant manager. And so dealing with companies from $500,000 up to 10 million. Again, this kind of links back to that hands-on experience, that was such an amazing opportunity, because I was able to learn and connect and understand industries and businesses and work with real companies. Whereas at that time when I was studying, I was learning about company A, B, and C in the textbook. And so it kind of was missing that kind of that real world kind of translation.
I know that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. to your point in regards to connecting with culture, when I had moved away, it was actually really difficult. So firstly, Tamworth isn't my community. So it's, whilst I grew up there, my family's all from Western Victoria. So there was already a sense of, dislocation from my culture. But at the same time, the upbringing that I had, the family that I come from, the connection also back up to Papua New Guinea, it never felt like I was splitting in two. It never felt like, I was needing to walk in these idea of the two worlds. And the way that I kind of think of that is, I don't, closet my Aboriginality when I put on my suit and become the banker. I don't closet my Aboriginality or leave that at home when I step out the front door and become, the Benson the Consul-General or Benson the public speaker. This is, it's all part of me, and it's all infused in one. And so wherever I go, my culture follows me. And that's the thing that's really kind of sustained me when, I move into different circles in regards to, in my professional career, or move internationally, or live overseas, or travel. The thing that is always part of me is actually my culture and my upbringing.
Beautiful. And so another thing to culture and your upbringing and faith is your family. And you've got a family of your own now, with your wife, Kate, and a beautiful little girl who you mentioned earlier. I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about your family and what you love most about being a father and a husband.
Oh, such a good question. Um, you know, becoming a father, if it felt very daunting. It felt like a huge question mark, and the pregnancy of the birth wasn't the easiest. We were really worried. We were told that we were to expect our daughter arriving at 26 weeks, and as 26 weeks got closer, we got to 27 weeks. We got to 28 weeks, and slowly we started moving through it. And there was, my wife had to actually stop work quite early. She wasn't, bedbound, but she had to kind of just take it easy, really, and just keep the bun cooking. and so Anais, her name, so her full name is Anais Ramor Saulo. Ramor is actually it's connected up to my father's land, so it's a Nalik name, which is the language group, or the community up in New Ireland province. But it's actually a very old name. So it's a name that's not really used widely. And so early on, when we knew that Kate was pregnant, we ended up going up to Papua New Guinea, and we were doing some customary work, but we ended up sitting down with our family, and we said to them, well, we want to be able to have, if it's a daughter, we want to be able to carry the name of our family, which is, the land and culture is passed down through the matriarchal system. Right. So it was very important to have, if we have a daughter, to actually have a name linked to one of our aunties or grandmothers, because it ties her to that land, or connects her back to that land. And it was actually one of our very old uncles, and it took him a couple of days. So they talked about it and reflected on it, and they came to us with this name, and they said, we believe that your daughter's name should be Ramor.
Yeah.
And it's a very old auntie. It's actually he's my uncle, great uncle. It's actually his great aunt. Who's connected in our family, and so having that kind of that old name was really important. But the name Anais, or if it's also pronounced Anais, is actually the word grace, but it also translates into God has shown favor. And as we were getting past the 28 weeks and up to 30 weeks, we hadn't told my father what the meaning of the name was, and he lives up in the village, and we hadn't told him about the meaning of it. And as we got past the concerns or the issues of Anais coming early, Dad said one time on a phone call, he said, it seems that God has shown favor.
Wow.
Which is it's an odd turn of phrase as well.
Yeah.
And my wife Kate nearly fell off the bed because she was like, what? No one says that. And so it kind of blew us away. But becoming a father, I was so nervous. And it was it's the most amazing thing to happen. Just the rush of endorphins mixed with like fear and concern and awe. as well. But in the process of becoming a father and learning on the job of becoming a father, it's actually the only job in inverted commas that I've ever taken on where I haven't been crippled with anxiety of being a failure.
Right.
Which is a very odd thing because it's one of the things that you can get very wrong.
Yes, indeed. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So it's been nice to just be so comfortable stepping into a new role, and and for the relationship with my wife, taking to that next level. We've been together for 11 years, nearly 12 years, but it just seems like another chapter,
Yeah.
which is really beautiful as it continues to unfold.
That's really incredible. So I first became aware of you through your work with the United Nations as Australian Youth Representative in 2011. Could you tell us a bit about that role and what it involved and what some of your favourite memories were from that year in 2011?
Yeah, no worries. So every year, it's for a 12-month tenure that an individual is appointed the Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations, and it's actually connected to two organisations. Well, one organisation in UN Youth, which is a national organisation, also has state-based chapters, and then also with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And this is an international program where a number of countries will actually have youth representatives that are appointed or elected for their youth organizations. And they represent the youth of their countries at the United Nations General Assembly, which happens every year. I was fortunate to be appointed, as you said, the 2011 Australian Youth Rep. And that year, there was actually about 300 people that had applied. I was about 21, going on to 22 at the time. But, under my belt, I had 6 years of working in a bank. Where most people would be
second year uni or something, right? Yeah,
spot on. Yeah, so they're still kind of studying, and that role really requires a professional to kind of step into it. And I think that was the kind of the skills that I was able to bring. So already knowing about, building relationships, already kind of knowing about, negotiations, these are tools of the trade as a banker.
Yeah.
And so that was an amazing kind of process to kind of go through. And then I remember the day that I got the phone call that I'd been appointed. And actually, I called my mum. I called my folks' house, and my mum was out at the time. But I told my dad, and he was over the moon. But the memory that really stands out for me was when I called my mum, and she was driving back from the shops. This is when they actually lived just outside of Mildura at this time, and so she pulled over the car. And I told her, and she's got really emotional, and she got a bit teary, and she said, growing up, they didn't even want to know about us. Now, for my mum to say that, what that means is, in 1967, when there was the referendum that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were actually acknowledged as citizens in Australia, my mum was 11 years old when that happened. And so she'd spent the majority of her formative years not only growing up in a tin hut with dirt floors on the outskirts of a small town called Bordertown in South Australia, but she'd had almost that identity being removed, or that statelessness, or that mindset of a statelessness. And so for me to call her as a 22-year-old and say that, I've been appointed to represent all Australian youth at such a high level. For her, she'd almost seen this. She'd just seen this come full circle in her lifetime.
That's very special.
It was incredibly special, and so that memory really sticks with me. And it's not only the sense of pride to the idea of making your parents proud, but it's also what that position represented in the scheme of movements, in the scheme of change in society. And so that was an incredible opportunity.
And the year involved you sort of touring around Australia before actually heading to the General Assembly in New York, and where you made a speech. Is that right?
Yeah, spot on. So I actually took about 6 months and traveled right around Australia. So I connected with over 6,000 people through face-to-face forums, workshops, and programs, and then a further 21,000 through online and social tools. And there's a number of stories that kind of stick out for me, and I'd love to be able to share one that I spoke about during during a speech that I delivered in Zurich in Switzerland as one of the most impactful moments in my time as the youth rep. It was actually during a road trip from Alice Springs up to Darwin. And then I jumped on a small plane and went up to the Tiwi Islands. And we were stopping at various schools along the way and running workshops with students. And we pulled up to a very small town called Elliot. And Elliot's just outside of a few kilometers, a few hundred kilometers outside of Tennant Creek. And I remember we pulled up on this particularly hot day. The sun was beaming down. And it was quite a windy, so it was a dusty day. And I remember when this I think it was a white Toyota Camry that was kind of almost red with dust. And I remember opening the door and stepping out, and it was like someone had just grabbed a bowling ball, the weight of a bowling ball, and just sat it on my chest. Like just ever so slightly, just kind of sat on my chest, so this weight was just there. And we walked past the corner store, and the corner store was covered with bars, and then it had all alcohol kind of promotions on it. So it had like the 4X or VB, or actually I think it was like MT Draft or something like that, kind of plastered on it. And walked up to the school, and we were able to sit in on a couple of lessons. And there was kids in these classrooms that were equivalent to grade 4, sitting next to and learning from the same book as a young person who should be equivalent to grade 8. So we've all heard of composite classes, when grade 2 and grade 3 kind of like put together. This was kind of next level. So this is
4 or 5 years apart, even longer. Yeah,
exactly. And so kind of that really, the basic education levels within this very small community. And during recess, the principal actually walked us around the school, and as the kids were playing, and he pointed out 2 young girls and 1 young boy, and he said to us, these 3 kids have the potential to be the first in their families, the first in their communities to actually graduate year 12, which no one had graduated from the school in the past 7 years. He shared with us earlier. And he said, these 3 have the potential to be the first in their families to graduate and break this cycle of disadvantage, which has gripped this town. And then he went on to explain that his tenure he was going to be a relief principal for 6 months. And he said, but that was 3 years ago. He goes, but they don't know it yet, but I'm actually here for them. And it was at that moment where that bowling ball, that weight on my chest just started kind of lifting. You started feeling a little bit lighter, like it was layers that were pulling away.
Yeah,
exactly. And that was actually, upon reflection, and this is something that carried me through when I went to other remote communities, or went into youth detention centers, or went to really challenging spaces or disadvantaged spaces, was this idea of a spark. The principal was the spark in that school, and no matter where I went, there was always one, and often more, but there was always one person who was kind of that beacon of hope, that believed in people, that backed people, and that was what gave me almost fortitude as I traveled around throughout that year.
Incredible. So those sort of like deeply personal and moving stories of severe disadvantage and inequity in Australian society. A lot of that's sort of obviously contrasted to a lot of your work as well, where you are at diplomatic forums and, in New York or Geneva or whatever, where you've met people like world historical figures like His Holiness the Dalai Lama or the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. So do you try to carry those stories that you just mentioned outside Tennant Creek with you when you kind of participate in that, I guess, more glitzy or world of international diplomacy or advocacy as well?
Absolutely. And that's, these are the stories and these are the memories that keep you grounded. And with that knowledge, that deep knowledge that behind every policy is a person, it's often easy. It's easy to forget when you're, working and operating in the ivory tower, that, the decisions that you're making actually have implications for real world impacts, or real world, people's lives. And so, being able to gather these stories as I was traveling around and actually reflect on emotionally, before I intellectualize it, emotionally, what kind of impact this had, because is the thing that's going to stay with me. And then actually be able to bring them through. So when I was based in New York, I actually led negotiations on 2 resolutions. One was the rights of the child, which had a focus on disability. There's a number of negotiations around the rights of the child, but the one that I was focused on was one with the focus on disability, and then the impacts of the global financial crisis on young people. And that particular resolution looked at the school to work transitions, the role of education in preparing young people for the world that they'll be stepping out in, and then also, which was relatively, not a large focus for young people, around entrepreneurship and transferable skills. And so, drawing on my own experiences as a school-based trainee, the impact that had on my life, but then also, going back and reflecting on the numerous schools and students that I'd actually connected with around, their concern and fear of stepping into the real world, or the anxiety that comes with getting ready to graduate and not knowing if you're ready to go to university, or if you want to work, or should I move away from home. So being able to connect real world challenges into those the halls of power in in the United Nations, or even in Canberra and in Parliament. It's so important for us for decision makers, or people that are kind of considered leaders, to continually anchor themselves back into the experience of real people on the ground.
So important, yeah. And to change back a bit, just carrying on with the thread of a few things you've spoken about as well in this interview, but you've spoken about or written about recently the pilgrimage that you and your wife took to the Camino de Santiago in Spain. So I was wondering if you could reflect on this experience and some of the lessons learned along the way, and the importance of faith in your life to family, but also to your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was in 2018. My wife and I, we made the decision that we'd actually watched the movie The Way. And I highly recommend watching this movie. And it actually kind of set us up for a bit of a falsehood. We were like, oh yeah, this is going to be pretty easy. They got Martin Sheen. If Martin Sheen can climb over the Pyrenees without breaking a sweat, I think we'll be fine. The Pyrenees is actually on day one when you do when we started, which you start in France and you head over the Pyrenees. Man, that was tough. That was very tough. And I wasn't, like Martin Sheen, where he just kind of mops his brow ever so slightly. I was downing water. I was sweating. But it was, that timing. So the timing was actually, how these things kind of roll around. So my wife was just finishing up working for a wonderful organization. My wife's a doctor in clinical and forensic psychology, and she focuses her work around refugees, but focus on torture and trauma, responsiveness to trauma. And so she was just finishing up, and people talk about, particularly in those really difficult industries, around burnout. And so we'd been talking for a number of months around that revitalizing or taking the time away to kind of regenerate. And so after we watched this movie, we said, all right, let's put this on the list. We're going to go and walk the Camino de Santiago. And become pilgrims, which is, this is the 800-kilometer hike.
Walking stick and everything,
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, that's it. And I was also turning 30 at that time in April, so we set out in early April, and we actually completed in 32 days. So we were averaging between 25 to 32 kilometers a day. Early on, it's incredibly tough, and they actually say the Camino is broken up into 3 stages. You've got the physical, the mental, and finally the spiritual. And as you're kind of moving through, across this beautiful land, there's, you really do, as in the physicality. You become very conditioned very fast because you're pulling on a heavy pack. So we're carrying between 7 to 9 kilos each. And pulling that on and traversing up and down territory. And then it's also the mental side, where you suddenly find yourself at 300 kilometers in, and knowing that you're about halfway, but you actually got a fair bit more to go, and feeling exhausted, feeling drained, but then also feeling really fresh, in the sense that you're walking through these really beautiful towns. You're having these wonderful conversations with people that you're meeting along the way. You're stopping into churches and taking the time out for yourself to reflect. So it's this kind of tension the mental and physical exhaustion mixed with this sense of beauty and awe of
And
what.
rejuvenation as well through beautiful
Yeah,
churches and beautiful people you meet along the way. Yeah.
absolutely. It's actually the right word, the rejuvenation.
Yeah.
Of feeling that, and then it moves into the stage where you're able to push through that, and you almost have the end in sight, and you realize that you've. Well, I realized at the time that I'd been focused on getting to the destination
Mm.
as opposed to actually enjoying the journey. And there was a number of moments that I was glad to be able to walk it with Kate, because she's the kind of person that takes the time. And so there's a number of moments where she would disappear, and I'd be looking for her, and I'd have to turn around and wait, and then she was like, "Oh no, come this way! I found something over here," and it would, it would break my like fixation
Mm.
on the end goal, which is the Compostela, or, getting the document at the end
Yeah.
of the
There's
walk.
adventures and joys along the way, right?
Exactly. So that was a beautiful lesson right there. But then also, when you get to the end, 800 kilometers is such an achievement. It's, such a distance right across the north of Spain.
It's like Melbourne to Sydney, basically, isn't it?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, spot on.
It's a long way.
Yeah.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so there's that realization that, you're strong enough to be able to do that. Your body is capable of incredible things, but then also, with every single step that you're taking, it takes you closer to your goal. And within that, there's a really beautiful lesson that you might not know. It's almost like there's a line from Martin Luther King. He said, "You don't have to see the full staircase as long as you can take that first step." And I think the biggest challenge is not necessarily taking that first step, but then the follow up with that second step. And so for me, the lesson there was actually, the second step is most important, because then you're in motion.
Yeah.
And there's no other way to go but forward. And and that was one of the great reflections that I had in my during that time, because I was also feeling this tension around, well, what next for me? I'd been the Australian Youth Rep. I'd run a National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy. I was looking back at going into the corporate sector and thinking about the role of finance and investment in Indigenous communities. But there's still that question mark: well, what's the bigger picture here? And without knowing what that bigger picture is, being able to take that first and then followed up by that second step, you're able to make things happen.
Having faith in a way. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned the National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy. You have been extensively involved in the social impact space in Australia, with a focus on Indigenous issues and diplomacy. So could you speak a bit about that, and I suppose the importance that it's had over the last decade and a bit of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that continually inspires me is being able to connect with young people, and young people, apart from just the youthful enthusiasm and wonder, but particularly the young people that I love working with, what I refer to as curious minds. The reason why I love curiosity and being able to cultivate that in young people, because everyone's curious. I think there's a moment in our life as we get older, we kind of lose that and kind of look at the more world around kind of certainty. But with curiosity, is it allowed for kind of ambiguity as well, and always asking that question of why and how. We're almost kind of programmed to stop asking the why and just kind of accept the what.
Yeah.
And so I think the working with young people and being able to connect with curious minds, that was really the essence of NILA, the National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy, was saying, I want to surround myself with curious minds. I want to surround myself with young people that are asking those questions, the hows and the whys, but are also being able to view themselves differently in regards to the world around them. They're almost being able to take an outsider's look on what's happening in their communities.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful line from Utaru Nunako, who's an Aboriginal poet from up Quandamooka country, which is North Stradbroke Island, and she had a wonderful poem called "The Dawn Is at Hand." And within that line, within the last stanza, there's a line that says, "Fringe dwellers no more." And the reason why I love that particular line and kind of mix that with the idea of curiosity is because it's these curious minds that are kind of questioning, how do we influence, or how do we inform, or how do we shift, and how do we shape things, and taking people from the outside, or ideas from the outside, and bring them into the mainstream, or bring them into wider consciousness. And so with the National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy, we actually, in the space of 2 years, launched 10 youth-led social action campaigns on things that were around, on issues that were relating to mental health, suicide prevention, climate change, constitutional recognition, which was a big focus at that time, the supporting LGBTIQ young people, and these are campaigns that were developed over the course of a week by
Yeah.
young people. It's amazing what you do of setting a challenge for a young person and kind of going, you've got 1 week to create a national campaign. Here's the tools. This is how we're going to do it. But it's actually up to you, and handing the power essentially into the hands of young people to be able to create and lead. It's
Be
amazing.
bold and imaginative as well,
Spot on. Yeah. And the way that I imagine these campaigns are not how they turned out, and the way they turned out, are far greater than the way I could have ever imagined it.
Yeah.
Because it's about young people speaking to other young people on issues that impact all young people, which is really powerful. And and that really kind of influenced the way that I also think about being a good convener as well, in regards to my life and my roles, is how do I actually hold space to be able to bring people together to have a respectful, informed debate or dialogue, because ultimately what we're going to get to is a place that's far greater than any single person could have imagined.
Yeah.
And that's an underlying principle or approach that I have in areas that I go, and places that I work. But I do want to pick up I'd like to pick up that question around kind of faith as well, because as I was saying, faith has played a strong role from my upbringing, connecting with the Camino de Santiago in 2018 through to now. When I think about the role of faith, it also connects really strongly into a line that my father said to me when I was quite young, and he said to me, "Never think the world is not yours." And for me at that time, it kind of went over my head. But as I reflect, as I get older, this idea that never think the world is not yours because of your skin color, because of your upbringing, because of your culture, because of your background. Everything in this life is afforded to you if you approach it with the right mindset and take that step. Now, the step itself is often the most scary thing. And one of my values that I try to live up to is courage. And courage at its essence, the etymology of courage is to be wholehearted. And you can't be wholehearted without faith, I believe, and being able to step out into the unknown, or step into spaces that that you've been excluded from in the past, or step into spaces that there's people that don't look like you.
Yeah.
It's actually stepping out into no man's land. It's stepping out in faith and just trusting that there's something there to catch your step.
Could you speak about that, this kind of emergence or growth in the term of Black excellence or Indigenous excellence, in the context of what you just spoke about, but also I don't know, it's something I've sort of witnessed over the last decade and a half, is the huge amount of young Indigenous-led organisations. Think about Common Ground now, the AIM, it's Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience, obviously NILA as well. Seems like, I don't know, there's like a real big drive amongst young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians today, in the last decade especially, about trying to take that next step, as you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it also is why it's so important to understand the history of movements as well, because there is that notion of to be Indigenous is excellence, is to be excellent, and Black excellence. And as you mentioned, there's a number of organisations and movements that are really building on that, and this is fantastic. And I'll come back to that as to why it's so important and why it's fantastic. But going back, if you go back into the civil rights movements, there's a really beautiful address or sermon by Martin Luther King where he talks about Black is beautiful. And he also has this really powerful line in regards to, he said, until we can actually reach down into our own hearts, and he's talking, to his community, and sign our own Emancipation Proclamation, then we will never be free. And the way that I reflect on that, and the way I think about that, is actually, when do we give ourselves permission? When do we give ourselves permission as Indigenous people or Black people to be excellent? Yeah. And who gives us permission? If it's not ourselves, then who are we waiting for to give us permission? And what we are seeing, and rightly so, in the last 10 years, particularly around the reconciliation movement, but more recently in regards to the Black excellence, this is us, and these are our people standing up and giving ourselves permission to be their full selves, to be their full excellent selves. And what we're going to see out of this is a more bold, a more confident, a more collective, or a more connected movement of people of color and Indigenous people that are actually that are actually shaping their own narratives. And this is why it's such an incredible movement to be able to be a part of, and to watch and to see how it's kind of moving, because this is really what we're seeing now. We're going to see a huge shift in regards to how we define for ourselves what success is, how we define for ourselves what our culture, our ever evolving culture is as a collection, as a collective of cultures and people.
Yeah, stunning. So to change tack a bit, you're off to Houston, Texas to take up the role of Consul General later this year, as we've mentioned. Could you speak a bit about what the role involves, and how do you feel about the significance of being the first Australian Indigenous Consul General, having just spoken about Black excellence?
It is a huge honour to be the first Indigenous Consul General to the US, anywhere in the world, but in the US, and being based down in Houston. Houston is such a significant place for it's the oil and gas industry, but what's often overlooked is also around the renewables and also tech. So we look at Austin, which is about 2 hours drive up the road from Houston, and that's looking like it's going to be the next tech hub in the US. From an Australian standpoint, from our standpoint in regards to Austrade and the Australian government, the US plays an incredibly important role in regards to foreign direct investment. So being able to invest in, the prosperity of Australia, so creating Australian jobs, but then also thought leadership, and also our industries, but then also trade and export. So the US represent for a lot of our businesses and exports is the frontier in regards to expansion for their own businesses and relationships, and growing their products and services internationally. So Houston and the US more broadly plays an incredible role for the ongoing prosperity of our nation.
Yeah.
My particular role, which I'm very excited about, touches on those aspects. So around attracting foreign investment, so looking at the investment arm, whilst being based in Houston, our export and our trade, but then also the element around public diplomacy as well. And public diplomacy is the area that I feel very comfortable in regards to building the relationships, making those connections, coming back to that idea of being a good convener. That is absolutely the role that I hope to play when I do touch down in Houston, and providing, in some cases, a soft landing for Australian businesses and Australians to be able to come into Houston, be able to connect with the right organisations, to be able to grow their impact. I've already had the opportunity since my announcement of the role to be able to connect with some of the First Nations groups, and this is something I'm really interested in because for the last 5 years I've been looking at how do you facilitate private investment into Indigenous businesses to be able to scale them, but also to be able to scale their impact. So in Australia, there's over 12,000 Indigenous businesses. We know that they're more likely to employ other Indigenous people, more likely to train Indigenous staff, and also more likely to reinvest back into their community as well. So if I was to play out that kind of equation in regards to bringing finance into their businesses, being able to scale them, it actually translates into greater impact as well.
Yeah.
And so for the last 5 years, we've been looking at what is the vehicle, what is the model to be able to facilitate that. And that conversation is actually, very in line with what's happening in the US. So in Houston, there's the Tunica Biloxi tribes of Louisiana. I'll also be looking across Louisiana and Oklahoma and Arkansas, as well as Texas. Wow. And, there's some really wonderful work that's being done there. And there's so many similarities in regards to the social outcomes of our communities, the challenges, relationship with governments and other partners, but then also I think the unifier across our groups is actually I guess the vision that we have for our nations, but then also for the young people that are coming through to step up as the next leaders, the next elders, the next custodians of our culture. So there's a huge alignment there as well.
Yeah, that's incredible. Is there a sense, though, in which by moving to the US, you're flying into the storm with the widespread civic unrest not really seen since, I think, the 60s, economic collapse and the devastating COVID-19 pandemic? Like, are you sort of at all worried about the environment you're heading into on a personal level?
Yeah, on a personal level, definitely in regards to the pandemic, is a huge worry. We just have to look at the rates of infection, as well as the unfortunate deaths that are happening across the US, and also globally, but obviously very relevant in Houston. That particularly down south, there is looking like it is going to be one of the epicenters in the US. So this is for myself, and the safety of my family is paramount, and that's reflected in the work, the risk assessments that we're already doing in preparation. Austrade is making sure that the safety of our teams internationally is front of mind for all of our teams that are across the world. And then you mentioned around the political unrest, so that's something that we're definitely following. We've got the election.
Australian politics seem like an absolute sort of child's play, doesn't it? In comparison, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. It feels like worlds apart at this stage. Obviously, we've got the election coming up in November, so we'll be watching that very closely. But at the same time, as we move into the US and into Houston, I'm there to do a very specific job around our trade and investment. And when I think about the relationships or the alliance between Australia and the US, these things far outdate, as in kind of outlast political cycles. So, this is building on decades of public diplomacy and work that's been done to really strengthen and connect our nations. And, if I can play a little role in regards to being a good convener and being able to bring parties together and people together for informed, respectful discussion, then that's the role that I really hope to play. In regards to the political makeup, Houston and Austin and Dallas, the major cities are typically more Democrat. They're more Democrat leaning. And then Texas itself is made up of over 250 counties, which are predominantly Republican. Right. And so there is that, that notion over the next few years that, Texas itself may look and feel like more of a purple state. So kind of that kind of mix between the two. Yeah. Obviously, at the moment, it does feel like that the Democrats and Republican Party are very, are so fragmented. But we also have to remember politics really plays a small role in our day-to-day life. And I think this is an important piece to remember, is that actually what's more important is how do we act as a citizen? How do we act as a neighbor? If politics plays a small role in our life, then the majority of our life in regards to other people around us, it's the people that we our friends, it's our family, it's the people that we meet down the street. We need to be thinking back, well, who's my neighbor? Or how can I be a better neighbor?
Yeah. I actually think it's sort of a perfect, you're the perfect person to be going into such a place in Houston, because of obviously your incredible history with, coming from a rural background, but growing up in an urban setting, bridging, many, many different cultures and traditions as well in your own personal background. But you've got a perfect diplomat sort of preparation, I think, for what will be no doubt a challenging role. But looking forward, what kind of an impact do you hope to have, not just the next couple of years during your career in the States, but in public service and diplomacy more broadly over the next few decades, if you want to even think that long?
Yeah. So Australia is where I want to be able to have an impact and leave my mark. And I think there's something really beautiful, and this is why my wife and I had been wanting to live internationally, is there's something very special about stepping outside and of Australia and viewing it from the outside in.
Yeah.
And just having that space as well, to really kind of consider where do I want to be in the future. Over the next few years whilst in this role, I think I'm going to absolutely learn so much in regards to diplomacy, the way that government works, how do you, from translating legislation into action through to the challenges of bureaucracy as well. I hope in the future being able to bring that back into, if I choose to go down the path of politics in the future, or if I choose to go down the path of going back into corporate or not-for-profit, these are the kind of skills and knowledge that I'll be able to bring to any space. I was recently asked to write an article for a wonderful magazine called Dumbo Feather, which is a social enterprise based down here in Melbourne. But
I love this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, they always write really beautiful pieces, and so I was asked to actually write a reflection around what does Australia look like in 20 years' time, and the narrative I was actually really struggling, because as you know, when you kind of look around and being the fact that we're in lockdown 2.0 at stage 4, it's really, in some days it's really hard to kind of look beyond that, and so as I sat down to write this particular article, I had to actually bring it home. I couldn't think about what the world would be like outside, so I had to think closer to home. And I was thinking, 20 years, my daughter will be turning 20. Stepping out into the world, thinking about the mark that she'll want to make and leave on the world, and I kind of think about, well, what kind of world do I want her to inherit, and what kind of world do I want her to step into, and one of the issues that has been in discussions quite a lot under, in the current conditions of lockdown, is around the impacts of mental health on young people, the rates of suicide, but then also something that was, Natasha Stott-Despoja gave a wonderful presentation and speech at the National Press Club recently on the scourge of and the pandemic of gender-based violence as well, which is a very real and very serious issue that is impacting women, predominantly women, across Australia, on a weekly, daily basis. And so when I think about, in 20 years' time, the world that I hope my daughter steps into is a world where we're actually able to address a lot of these things. And the way that I actually started thinking about this article was not about casting my minds forward. It was actually about starting from today, thinking about tomorrow.
Beautiful. First step. Yeah.
But it's the first step. Yeah, because ultimately, our decisions that we make today will impact and create the future for tomorrow. And so, if I want my daughter to believe in the same truth that my father told me in regards to never think the world is not yours, I need to start today to ensure that the world that she inherits actually is a world that is hers, and that she can shape.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Finally, to wrap up the interview, both you and Bob Hawke were born in Bordertown, South Australia. So I was wondering if politics is something you consider down the track. I think you've already mentioned that, but I just thought I'd ask it again.
I love that you brought that up. So I'd love to share just a really brief story.
Yeah.
So this is years ago, and family stories, there's truth and there's some kind of like question mark around family stories. And so story goes, my grandmother, she lived in Bordertown for all her life. She passed away a few years ago, but she lived to 100 years old. Actually, no, she would stop me and say it was 106 months. So get that right, Benson. Yeah. And so we had some family, aunt and uncle, rock up to Bordertown wanting to track down Auntie Jessie, which is my grandmother, and they didn't have her address, and so they thought, you know what, we'll just hang out at the post office, and we'll see a brother or sister kind of walking down the main street, which is the main street's called Woolshed Street. And as they're sitting there, they're kind of waiting and waiting. They're not seeing too many people, and then suddenly, Uncle he like spies a fella over the hedge, And he's like, oh yeah, there's a brother. I'll go and say good day to him. And so he walks up and kind of jumps from behind the hedge, and it's the brass bust of Bob Hawke that's standing there. It's like, well, he's not going to help us. But this particular brass bust, it's brilliant. He actually has half his nose missing. Because apparently, as urban legends go, that a disgruntled farmer from Bordertown backed up his truck, wrapped a chain around Bob Hawke, and kind of dragged him up Main Street. And
it's like a wild place, man.
Yeah, it's very wild. It's great that you mentioned that we're from the same town, because I often think about this and thinking, coming back to that idea of those cycles that kind of go on in life, these seemingly coincidental kind of happenings. For me to be born in Bordertown, so my family lived up in Brisbane. My mum was born in Bordertown, and I'm the youngest, and she wanted me born in Bordertown. And so we actually, mum and dad and my older brother and sister drove down from Brisbane, and apparently mum was actually kind of going into labour as we were arriving in Bordertown, and
speeding to get there on time. Yeah,
no doubt. And so I was actually born in Bordertown, and I'm the only one apart from my mum born in Bordertown in our immediate family. And so there's this really almost funny, kind of curious kind of thing that, if politics is the path that I want to go down, is there something about Bordertown?
Yeah, it's producing all the future pollies and prime ministers, maybe. Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Benson. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and all the very best to you and your family for the move to the US.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.